Had to get the recording going up here too, that way we're in sync. Well, good morning. Good to see everybody out. And I tell you, just because Everly is still the star of the show, every time we've had several births since I've been preaching here for the past couple years, and I love seeing new babies in the audience. I think that's great. And what's interesting is sometimes they complain less than the toddlers. So it's great. And great to have some guests and family visiting with us. You all are in for a special treat today. We're going to be talking about why the book of Numbers is not boring. At least I hope that's what you guys think by the time I'm done. Now, we're in another week of our book-by-book series in which we are studying through the key themes and events of each book in the Old Testament. We're in book 4 of the Torah series, being the first 5 books, the 5 books that were written primarily by Moses and collectively known as the Torah. And I haven't said this before, so I'll take just a moment to say it now because it'll help get our mindset for as we talk about not only this book of Numbers, but especially when we get to Deuteronomy for our next lesson. But these first 5 books are known as Torah, which is the Hebrew word that means law and instruction. It has a twofold meaning, and that's so indicative of the way that the Jewish people always viewed these first 5 books. To include Jesus and the first century Christians, when they would look back at the Bibles of their day, the Old Testament, this was the book of... He did that last week too. It keeps skipping ahead on me. These were the books that they'd look to as being the instructions for how they are to live their life. But as we've been finding week by week as we go through this, there's a whole lot more than just... Oh, get the mic on. All right, there we go. Thanks, Gary. There we go. There's a lot more than just law codes in these 5 books. Now, certainly Leviticus, which we talked about last week, it had a lot of law codes, but even those law codes are taking place within a historical narrative. And so the way that Jesus and the Jewish people looked back on the Old Testament and specifically the 5 books of the Torah was that not only do the law codes teach us, but even the historical narrative and the events that are happening, they're all meant to reveal something about God's character and human nature that we are to learn from and apply in our lives. And that's really important for us as we look back on these events and these writings. Not that we live under the Mosaic law today, but we can still find the principles behind everything that's happening in these books and think, man, that's the wrong way to live, or wow, that's the right way to live with God. And so it's important for us to understand that even the Jewish people, when they looked at this book, they looked at the law codes for how to live, but they also looked at the historical events of, hey, what happened with Moses? What happened with the high priest Aaron? I want to live that reflects the good things about their lives. I want to avoid the lifestyle practices that the people in Korah's rebellion, which we're going to talk about today, I don't want to do those things. All of it was meant to be instructive, to guide, both to restrict certain behaviors, but also to set free for certain ways of living as well. So that being said, I'm going to do just a very, very quick overview of that brought us up to this point. Genesis, it's the book of beginnings. It's where we learn about the origins of life, but also the origins of death, the origin of sin, but also the origin of hope as well, as God's plan to restore the relationship that was broken by our sin. Now, I didn't title, when I preached this sermon, I didn't title it The Virgin Birth and the Promised Deliverer. That's something I added in as I was thinking about this series more, because in Genesis, we read of the way that God uniquely created life and gave that life a special purpose. And we read of how He has promised a deliverer who will be born into the world of a virgin, who would be begot in a unique and special way that would set all people free from the consequences of the sin that entered the world. So, that was like a 2-hour-long series. That was a 2-parter. You can go back and watch those recordings. But then we get to Exodus, which was my favorite one. I love the book of Exodus, and it was my favorite in this series so far. But to me, I look at Exodus as the gospel of the Old Testament, because in Exodus we read of where salvation is brought down by God as He set free the Israelites from Egyptian slavery. They cried out to God for rescue, and God delivered. And you know what? That deliverance was freely given. They didn't earn that. God did it for them because He was fulfilling His promise to Abraham that Abraham's line would be a blessing to all the nations. They're not to live as slaves. But even though that salvation was freely given, God still set forth certain expectations of them. If they wanted to be free from Egypt, there were certain things they had to do. One of those was celebrating the Passover lamb. If a Jew did not celebrate that Passover event, then they would be just as guilty and face the consequences that Egypt faced. And so we see that God can freely give something, but still expect us to do something to receive that gift. And so in like manner, our salvation is not earned by good things that we do, because it's been freely given by Christ's death as our sacrificial lamb. And though this gift of salvation from our sins is freely given, we still respond to that by embracing the new life as a Christian and by being united with Christ in the watery grave of baptism. And we talked about that more, of how crossing the sea was the Israelites' baptismal event. Then in book 3, which we talked about last week, was Leviticus, which I challenged to think about as the cross of the Old Testament. Leviticus is the very center of the Torah, and the very center of Leviticus, there's a very, very special event that happens. There's the appointment of a Messiah. I didn't use that language last week. I was running late on time. But we see that in the center of Leviticus, Aaron is appointed as the Messiah, meaning the anointed one that could go before the throne of God and offer up an atoning sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins. And this Day of Atonement is in the middle of the Torah. It's the most central event that all of Israel was to look back on and remember. And that brings us to the book of Numbers. And in Numbers, what I see in this book, to summarize it in a phrase, is this is the test of faith. They've had their salvation event, they've had forgiveness of sins, and now they're being led into the promised land. But on their journey into the promised land, they are going to face several tests of faith. There's many failures that happen. There's a few successes. But what we see is God's mercy reigning throughout, both justice and mercy together. Now, I thought about originally calling this lesson The Forge, because this is when Israel faces the type of challenges that James writes about. In James chapter 1, when James writes to Christians, and he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." This was the mindset that the Jewish people, by vast majority throughout their history, they didn't have this. When a test of faith arose in their life, they said, "How could God allow this?" And they run away. And they try to run back to Egypt. James says, listen, there's going to be tests in your life. There's going to be hardships. There's going to be temptations. There's going to be trials. Some of those are Satan trying to pull you away, but some of those are God trying to strengthen you. You don't get stronger in the weight room by lifting the 1-pound weight every day. You got to have some challenges to get stronger. And so James encourages us to look at the challenges in life and think, my faith's going to stand firm in this, and when I get through it, by God's grace, my faith's going to be even stronger by it. That's the mindset that Israel lacked throughout this book of Numbers. And so hopefully our own faith will be edified as we read about their own failures and successes. So as we go throughout this lesson, we're going to follow this outline. We're going to look at the historical context for Numbers. Then we're going to do the summary of content, and then we're going to close with some key principles, kind of keeping the same order that I've done for the last few lessons now. When we look to the historical context, this slide should be familiar because it's the same one from Leviticus, because Numbers starts exactly where the book of Leviticus ends. And so just as a refresher for what the people of Israel are going through when the book of Numbers starts, they just spent hundreds of years in Egypt, including the last 80 of those being subject to slavery and having their Egyptian rulers exercise infanticide against them. They're murdering the Israelite children. And so they plead to God, and God rescues them out of Egypt through signs and wonders of the plagues. And then he leads them with Moses as their shepherd. God leads the Israelites to Mount Sinai. I'm going to throw a map up on the screen in the next slide. And Mount Sinai is their waypoint between Egypt and the Promised Land. I didn't map it out, but it's pretty close to a middle point. All right? But this is where God takes them so that he can give them instruction. This is the location, Mount Sinai, in 1446 BC, where God gives Moses the main body of teachings to develop Israel as a holy nation, as a new culture, as a new people group that know how to live righteously so that God can dwell among them. He's erasing Egyptian culture from their lifestyle, and what he's doing is he's giving them these teachings to inoculate them against the immoral culture of the Canaanites, which is where he's sending them. The promised land is Canaan's land. And we read in both Exodus and Leviticus of how the Canaanite people in that land, they have corrupted the land by their wickedness. And so God's preparing them for both military war, but also spiritual warfare against these people. That was one of the key themes of Leviticus. Now that God has taught the people how to represent his divine nature on earth, now he's going to lead them to the promised land. That journey from Sinai to Canaan's land, that is the book of Numbers. So, with that being said, here's where we are in the world. What we have up there, I found this online. I'm not that cool with pictures to have done this. I just typed in map for the book of Numbers, and this popped up. I'm like, that's a pretty good illustration. The 3 main locations for the book of Numbers. And so what I'm going to do is, as I go through the summary of content, I'm just going to reference kind of where these locations are. But to start us off, we're down here in Mount Sinai. Now, I'll say this. We don't know exactly which peak was Mount Sinai. There's some debate. Some archaeologists think they found the one, but as far as I know, we don't know exactly which peak it was, but it was in this region. But thanks to archaeological discoveries, we know with a high degree of certainty where pretty much everything on this map is. To include the major cities we're going to look at with Kadesh, with the nations of Midian and Moab. These are places of just historical fact. There's numerous ancient writings from different people groups that confirm where these places were located. So that allows us to kind of map roughly where God was leading the people and the route that they took. So big thanks to the science of archaeology for helping us kind of confirm the biblical narrative on this. So all that being said, the first 10 chapters of Numbers, I summarize that with the line of prepare the battle march. You see, in the first 10 chapters, God is preparing the nation of Israel for battle as they enter into the promised land. Now, he's already told them that he's going to lead them in the battle. He's going to fight with them. He's going to ensure that they don't lose. That they are going to have to destroy many city-state people groups as a form of justice because of their sins. We know not just from the Bible, but historical record that these Canaanite city-states that are up there around number 3, they are living lives of just wanton wickedness. They're a very violent people group. They worship false gods by burning their children alive. They practice just open sexual immorality. And these are things that God is no longer going to tolerate. And so he's using the nation of Israel to wipe them out. And God is preparing them for this. And so as part of that, in these first 10 chapters, we see that God commands a census be taken, and then he forms, we find that there's 600,000 able-bodied men that are ready for war, and then God tells them their marching formation. It's pretty fascinating. It's, hey, go out there, count how many soldiers you got, and now I want you to organize them, and here's the battalion to the east, and the battalion to the south, and to the west, and to the north, and this is going to be how you march into the land. And we're going to talk about that point again towards the end of this lesson, because it's really cool. But then we see that after giving the marching formation, we see a list of different additional purity laws and remaining morally clean. We see it reinforced how grave an offense that adultery is. And then we see this very interesting vow. I mentioned it in the adult Bible class, called the Nazirite vow. And this could be taken by any Israelite, male or female, in which they voluntarily take this vow to obey a higher standard of purity. So not only are they not going to drink strong drink, they're not even going to eat grapes from the vine. They're not going to shave their beards. I don't know what that means for the women. Maybe they don't shave their legs. I don't know. But they're not going to shave. And so they are holding themselves to a higher standard of purity for God. And there's no reward for this. This is something that there's no guarantee of additional blessings. This is just something that if somebody wants to serve God even more, here's something a little extra, a little cherry on top that you can voluntarily do. We only know of 4 people in the Bible that did this. The prophet Samuel, the judge Samson, John the Baptist, and the apostle Paul. Now, there may have been others, but those are the only 4 that we know about. And so this is going to be, again, another point that I revisit when we get to our key lessons here. So I'll just kind of put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it on our last slide for today. Now, skipped ahead again. Whoa, too much. That's the one I want. Then we move forward into chapters 10, verse 11, through chapters 14. And what I'm calling this section is the March of the Faithless. Because starting in chapter 11 and really going through chapter 32, there's 10 failures of faith committed by the Israelites. And we see 3 of those here in this section on this march up to the Promised Land. See, things are looking pretty good for Israel when they step off from Mount Sinai and they begin their travel up north. And that lasts for all of about a couple days. The journey from Mount Sinai to Kadesh is about 11 days. Somewhere along that way, the people get hungry and they complain that God isn't providing for them. Now, both God and Moses are very angry by this because God has already shown them time and time and time again that He will provide for their needs. He has given them the blessings of miraculous bread and quail countless times in the past. And yet they are not trusting Him once again. And Moses is so angry by their lack of faith in complaining about their hunger that he's ready to quit. He's like, God, I'm done. I can't lead these people anymore. This is just too much for me to handle. Let this be somebody else's job. And now I think there's a little lesson in here about how Satan can use the ungrateful attitude of others to drag down even the best of spiritual leaders. But we see God's also angry at this, but what He does is He gives the people food. He makes sure they're not hungry anymore, but He does it with a twist. Everyone who eats the food with ravenous gluttony will die. And so we see many lose their lives because they take for granted the blessings from God. They don't approach what God has given as a gift, as something to be celebrated, as something to be shared, but as something to be hoarded, to kept for themselves, stuffed to the gills. And there's, once again, a lack of gratitude that happens from the people. And then we have the failure of Miriam and Aaron. These were Moses' siblings, and they challenge his authority because they don't like that he is married to a non-Israelite. And because Miriam challenges Moses' leadership, God punishes Miriam with 7 days of leprosy for not recognizing, listen, you may not like it, but I chose your baby brother Moses to be the people's leader. And to disrespect him is to disrespect me. And so she suffers 7 days of leprosy, and then she goes through the ritual cleansing laws and is welcomed back to the camp. And then thirdly, we have the great failure of the spies' report. See, when they get to Kadesh, they're right on the border of the Promised Land. And they send out 12 spies to go scout out the terrain and to scout out the enemy camp. What happens is the spies are gone for 40 days, and they come back and they're like, boy, the fruit is so rich and bountiful in this land. God knew what He was talking about. This is a good place to be. This is truly the land of milk and honey. But I got bad news. The people there are pretty strong. And I don't think we're going to survive this. So we need to go back to Egypt. What a great failure of faith. And so God punishes Israel because they follow after the heart of these 10 spies that say, no, we're not strong enough to beat these guys. And they desire Egypt. And so God says, all right, here's what I'm going to do. You're going to be sentenced to 40 years of exile from the land. You're going to be wandering in the desert land for 40 years, so that every one of you that is an adult, that's accountable for their own actions, you're going to die out, and you're not going to get to enter the promised land, but your children will. But there's something important that happens here, though. I said 10 of the spies, right? 2 of them remain faithful to God, Joshua and Caleb. They come back, and they're arguing with the 10, and they say, no. Yeah, the people are strong, but they're not as strong as God. If God can defeat Egypt, which was the global empire at the time, he can surely defeat these little tribal city-states. Don't have fear, but take courage, because God is going to be with us. And so those are the only 2 of this generation that God allows to enter in, because their faith was unwavering. And they believed that God could overcome any obstacle that they face, no matter how fearful they might be. They trusted in God. So anyway, that leads us to the next section, chapters 15 through 19, which I title Lost in the Woods. Not the Disney theme song from Frozen 2. It lasts a little bit longer than a 2-minute melody. 40 years in the wilderness. And now not much is recorded as happening during this time, but there are a couple very, very important events that are recorded for us in these chapters. And the first, which I don't have on the slide, is we see an example of what happens when a lone individual breaks the Sabbath and he disobeys God's law regarding keeping the Sabbath. And then after that individual is punished for his violation, God specifically commands the people to hold a reminder to him, a blue cord under their clothing, so that they remember to obey his word. And that's going to be a theme that we pick up on during our key principles slide. But the 2 that I have up there are both related to the same event. There's Korah's rebellion, which was an initial revolt, and then after that one happens, it inspires a second rebellion shortly thereafter. So what happens in these events is really just one of the greatest tragedies that we have in the book of Numbers, if not the Torah. We see that the Levitical families, those that have been designated by God as the tribe that is to represent him even more especially than the rest of Israel. They're the ones that are to work in his tabernacle. They're the ones that are authorized to bring sacrifices for the people. They're to be the intermediaries for the people. Well, one of the families within this group, they get jealous of Moses. They get jealous of Aaron, because Aaron is given the special status as high priest, the only one from among them who can go into the center of the tabernacle to see the mercy seat and throne of God. And they get jealous. They say, hey, we're just as good as Aaron. We're just as good as Moses. Doesn't God love all of his people? And so what Korah does is he enlists a rebellion of 250 family leaders to rise up and attempt to kill Moses and Aaron. But Moses' response, Moses is like playing like 4D chess with this, because he gives just the most epic like troll response. He says, okay, people, I hear your complaints. So here's what we're going to do. What I want you to do is, you 250 leaders that have come to kill us and think that you can go into God's throne room, why don't you go get some fire censers, which were special plates for holding incense for burning. Why don't you go get your fire censers, and Aaron's going to get his, and why don't you go to God's temple, the tabernacle, and just let him choose? And the reason that this kind of makes me laugh, and I say that Moses is like playing 4D chess here, is because this is exactly what Aaron's own sons did and were killed by God for it. Nadab and Abihu, they would have inherited the high priesthood had they just obeyed God. What they did was they tried to usurp their father as the high priest, and they bring their own fire censers to the tabernacle, and the fires that they were bringing as an offering to God turns on them and consumes them. So Moses is like, I got this idea. They think they can handle this. Well, let's just let God choose. And this thing has a mind of its own. And so that's exactly what happens. The people say, okay, fair deal, we'll do that. And well, we had a repeat of Nadab and Abihu. That's exactly what happens. They bring their unauthorized fire before the Lord, and the fire turns against them and consumes them. But then another tragedy happens. The rest of the nation of Israel, they see this happening, and they think that Moses is to blame. They don't realize that God was the one who did this. That God is the one who was making it clear, like, no, I have picked who your leaders are, and you're going to listen to them. There's a reason I chose them, and you need to listen to them. And so the rest of the people, they think Moses is to blame for this. So the whole nation of Israel rises up to kill Moses and Aaron, their leaders, their shepherds. And then when that happens, we see this extremely powerful event take place where God, he's ready to just exterminate them once again. I've lost count by now. I should go back in my Bible and tally it up for you guys. Between Exodus and this event in Numbers, I think we're on the 4th time that the entire nation of Israel has done something so faithless that God is ready to wipe them all out and start over with just Moses and create a new nation from just Moses. And so God is ready to do that again here. And so we see the fire of God coming down to destroy the entire nation of Israel. Then Moses and Aaron do the most unthinkable thing. They get between God and the people. Specifically, Moses tells Aaron, we got to stop this. Grab your offering. Go stand in God's fire. It's the only way the people will be saved. This is a Jesus-level event here. It's no wonder that Aaron and Moses were chosen to be the leaders. That's the heart that they had. Servant leaders who were willing to risk their own lives for the good of the people. Truly a shepherd that would do anything for his sheep. These are the leaders that God chose for the people. And I have to wonder if this is exactly why he chose them. Many times we see Moses is the one who steps forward to do this type of thing, but now it's Aaron as the high priest that acts as that savior figure, that has this cross-level event in which he is willing to offer up his own life as a sacrifice so that God would spare the people. And that's exactly what happens. God sees Aaron's sacrifice, his willingness to die for the people, and his anger is quenched. So, that leads us to the rest of the book, because the people survive. Man, this thing keeps jumping ahead. So, chapters 20 through 36, I've kind of labeled this, Ready the Warriors Again. And the reason is because we have the second census that's commanded. So, 40 years has now passed. God has brought them once again to the borders of the Promised Land, and he's preparing them to enter. And during this time, God is going to bless Israel with many military victories as they are having to fight enemy camps that seek to destroy them. And God provides spiritual reinforcements as he appoints Joshua to be the successor of Moses. Moses is like 120 years old at this point. Like, he can kick the bucket any day now. Who's going to be next? And so God appoints Joshua to be the successor. And Joshua is somebody who has proven his skills both as a warrior in battle, as a spy, but also as somebody who's faithful to God, because he has been walking with Moses throughout Moses' entire life as the shepherd of Israel. However, there's still more tests of faith and failures that come. And I'll try to finish this section up quickly so that we can get into kind of some key principles for us to think about, to chew on, and to apply from this book. And so the first failure is that the people are thirsty and hungry once again, and they complain, and they don't trust in God's power to provide. But this time, it's more than just their thirst that we see as a failure, but we see Moses' only recorded failure that we know of at this point in his life. The people's constant complaining has finally gotten under his skin, so that when he says, God, the people are thirsty, can you give us some water? God says, okay, go speak to the rock, and water will pour out of the rock. Well, Moses is pretty hot and angry at the people, so he doesn't speak at the rock. He kind of does what my dad does when he was watching football, and he has to find the softest pillow he can to chuck it, right? He's got to have like that physical catharsis to get out some frustrations. So Moses takes his staff and he strikes the rock. That's not what God said. It's not what he said at all. Now, God still provided water for the people, but because Moses struck the rock, because he disobeyed God, God said, sorry, Moses, I'm not going to let you in. I'll let you see the promised land. I'm not going to let you in. We see a very high standard here. And once again, I'll reference the book of James, who says that not many of you should want to be teachers. Teachers of God's word are held to a higher standard. We're expected to know it. We're expected to have a higher degree of faith. And this is the standard that Moses is being held to here. And this is a huge blow to Israel because Moses was their Jesus figure. He was their shepherd, their prophet. He was their intermediary with God. And if even he can fail, then who could ever live up to God's expectations? This is kind of like that, what do you do when your hero falls type of moment? Like when you realize that maybe your mom and dad aren't perfect the way that you thought they were when you were little. It's like, man, how do I live with this knowledge knowing that my dad's not a superhero and neither is my mom, but they're human too? There's this great kind of angst amongst the people. It's like, oh boy, if even Moses can fail, what do we do? Well, there's still hope. And there is that hope in that successor that's chosen. The person who would replace Moses as their leader, the person who would lead them into the promised land. I said his name once, but I'll say it in a different language. It was Jesus. Jesus would be the one to bring them into the promised land. You see, Jesus and Joshua are the same name. Jesus is just the Greek version. Joshua is the Hebrew version. We see that this name, Jesus, Joshua, it means that Yahweh is salvation. This is the name that when an angel appears to Joseph and Mary and says, hey, Joseph, don't worry, Mary ain't cheating on you. This is the Son of God. You will name him Joshua. You will name him Yahweh is salvation. That not only reveals who he is and what he would do in his earthly life, but that would reveal to all of Israel the type of person to look back to in their Bibles and say, this is the hero figure we've been waiting for. This is the Joshua that's going to lead us into the promised land. This is our hope for salvation. And just as certainly, Jesus is our salvation today. And he is the one who will lead all of God's people to the final promised land. Now, I kind of digress. I'll go back to our text as we wrap up our little summary here. The last great failure that we see in this portion is that which occurs at Midian. And we see the people from the nations of Moab and Midian, they come together, they collude together, and they seek to destroy Israel. But what they do is they try to appoint a pagan prophet by the name of Balaam. And this Balaam figure, he's very interesting because we have other historical writings outside the Bible that talk about this very famous sorcerer, a diviner, a prophet of the gods who is able to perform these great feats. And so Moab and Midian, they pull their resources together and they pay Balaam to curse Israel. But something really quite, I would dare say, miraculous happens in that God speaks to a pagan prophet and says, you're going to bless my people. And what's really fascinating, we don't have time to dig into it, what's really fascinating is the blessings that Balaam gives upon Israel, they are messianic prophecies that have a double fulfillment. Balaam prophesies that there would be a king of Israel who would rise up and conquer its enemy nations. But the language that's used refers to a God king. There's going to be a God who comes down to earth to reign as king from the people of Israel who will vanquish all enemies. We see this fulfilled initially by Joshua as Joshua is chosen as the leader to into Canaan's land and to defeat them, the Midianites, right then. But we also see this fulfilled in Jesus in the way that he is literally God on earth coming. And it's so fascinating that we see a messianic prophecy about Jesus coming from a foreign, pagan, idolatrous prophet. Truly, God works in mysterious ways, I suppose. But the point is this. after the failure of Midian, what Midian does is they realize that they won't have a military victory. Like, okay, if Yahweh is blessing them and he's going to fight for them, we know that we can't send our soldiers out. They're just going to die. So we have to do something different. We're going to fight with unconventional warfare. This is like a special ops operation. This is spiritual warfare. Because we know that the people of Israel, they've been following a really strict diet. They've been complaining about being hungry. We know that they are following very strict marital and sexual practices. And we know that they're kind of angry with their God right now. So let's send them temple prostitutes. And what happens is 24,000 men of Israel fall victim to this ploy and begin worshiping false gods and begin sleeping with these prostitutes and begin, the text isn't explicit, but there's a strong indication that some of the men of Israel even began sacrificing their own children to the gods of Midian. And so God has a purging, and he clears the camp of anyone who was guilty of chasing after the Midianite women and gods. And it's a great tragedy, but yet we still see God's mercy through this because God leads Israel to a military victory and of course, leads them into the promised land. But that's where the book of Numbers ends. That's where Deuteronomy begins. So as we close, let's just consider a few key lessons to kind of think about, to chew on, and consider how we can apply in our lives today. And so number one, keep the cross at the center of life. So this is where I get to nerd out for just a moment. I spent probably 2 hours trying to find a good background image for these slides to represent the book of Numbers because of this point right here. I said at the beginning, when God is giving Israel their marching formation to go into the promised land, if you got to nerd out, you got to get like a scratch pad and like do a little doodle as you read along. The formation that he gives them is in the shape of a cross. It's really quite fascinating. And at the center of the cross, so this is like literally what the nation of Israel would look like as they're coming from the wilderness into the promised land. They are marching in the formation that looks like the cross, and at the very middle of that is God's mercy seat, the place where the atoning sacrifice takes place. And as they are doing this, when they got to stop for the night, they're to make their camp, and they are to turn their tents so that no matter where they are on this cross formation, all of them would sleep facing the middle of the camp, facing the place where God would reside, facing the place where forgiveness of sins is offered up. And so I want to challenge that this little illustration of how the Israelites were to march is a very powerful reminder that in all aspects of Jewish life, they were to remember God's salvation. And in like manner, we are to do the same. In all aspects of our life, we need to keep the cross at the center of our life. Got gremlins in here. So, the second thing, I guess you all already saw this, is that God fulfills Moses' desire for all of his people to be prophets. All the way back in Numbers chapter 11, when I said that Moses is like so angry that he wants to quit, he's like, God, I can't lead these people anymore. What he asked God for is that God, I don't want to be a special prophet anymore. I don't want to be a leader. Can't you just make all people your prophets? Can't you make all people have your spirit that is with me? Can't you give it to everyone in the camp? That is fulfilled in the New Testament. That is fulfilled after Jesus' death and resurrection, when he promises that those who are baptized will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. You see, all Christians are to be prophets of God. Not that we can foretell the future, because that's not what the word prophet means. A prophet just means somebody who is speaking on behalf of someone else as a representative, as an ambassador of sorts. All Christians are supposed to be a prophet for God because we represent His Spirit. His Spirit resides in us. And we are to convey His divine will in the salvation offered to Jesus to all the world around us. This is both a blessing and a responsibility. Because what this means is that as Christians, we have a special relationship with God that no one else has. That's a blessing. But it's a responsibility. Because we're to desire the same as God desires, and that's for all people to be saved. And we are to act as His prophets to go out and to speak His words so that all people would know Him. Another, man, it jumps ahead faster than I can keep up. All right, the third one is that we need to trust in the Lord when faith is tested. Now, I just talked about Midian. And I think that might have been the greatest test of all, because Midian was able to quench all of Israel's desires. You're thirsty? Hey, we got a lot of drink over here. Come experience some of that fine Midian wine. You're hungry? We've got buffets. You should come check out our temples. It's just lined with meats. You want women? We got plenty of those too. Pretty much every way that Israel could be tempted by their own desire, Midian offers them. I don't think it's any wonder that we had thousands of Israelites fall victim to this. And sometimes we might ask the question, but why? Like, why does God give certain rules and certain restrictions? Well, as we talked about during our lesson in Leviticus, some of God's rules are truly morally good and superior to everything else, right? Like, don't steal, don't lie, don't offer your child up as a sacrifice. Like, it's just, you shouldn't even have to say that, but that's the world that they're living in. But then we see other laws were simply about being holy and being set apart from the rest of the world, so that when other people look at you, they say, you know what, there's something different about them. Maybe they're living for God in a way that I've not seen before, and the way that we live should make people question their own faith. Like, am I living right with God? Am I really trying to avoid everything I should? And am I really exalting the name of Jesus the way that I should? Life is going to be filled with temptations. And I've got to refer back to James once again, as James tells us, the root of those temptations is our own desires. And this is where sometimes we don't have to know all the reasons why God gave us a rule. We just have to trust that His desire for us is better in the long run than our desires for us. And so this is where I want to return to that pin I put up there that I talked about, the blue cord that Israel was to have. And that happens in Numbers 15. And let's see, how am I on time? I got just a few minutes left, so I'm actually going to turn there. Numbers 15, verse 37. Numbers 15, verse 37. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and to remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which are inclined to whore after. So you shall remember and do all my commands, and be holy to your God. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Yahweh your God." And the reason I wanted to highlight this is because there's such powerful imagery here that our eyes and our hearts, their desires are always looking down into the world for material things to satiate our appetites. And so what God commands Israel is, you're always looking down on earthly things, so next time you look down on an earthly thing, I want you to tie this blue cord on your garment so that when you look down, you see that blue cord and you remember me. So why blue? Well, blue was the symbolic color that represented the heavens, right? The sky is blue, right? But more than just like the sky above, blue represented the doorway into God's throne. The doorway not just into the heavens of the sky, but the heavens of the spiritual realm. So when you are looking down with your eyes and your heart on fleshly desires, I want you to see blue and remember to look back up. Look to my ways, because my ways are higher. My ways are what's good, because I'm the one true God, and you need to trust in me. So remember, when you're tempted to look down, look up. Look up to His word, look up to His will, look up to His desires for your life. And I'm not pressing these buttons, it's just skipping ahead. So the last point I have for us today, and then we'll close, is this. That title does not mean value. Title does not mean value. Many times throughout the book of Numbers, we see that Moses' leadership was challenged. It was challenged by his own sister. It was challenged by the family of Korah. It was challenged by the entire nation at one point of Israel. And another pen that I put over here was the Nazirite vow, right? This was a special vow that any person could take. Now I'll fill in the rest of that detail. The requirements of this vow was to live like a high priest. Anyone of God's people could live like the high priest. They just couldn't serve in the office. But if you want to feel as close to God as the high priest is, there's nothing stopping you. You can take this vow and do that. But you're just not going to serve in the office because God has already appointed that. Because the position of a priest or a high priest doesn't make them any more or less saved. It didn't make them any more or less special in terms of salvation. It just meant they had extra responsibility. In the New Testament, this is how Jesus views his relationship with God. He's equal with God, but yet he comes to be a servant to all. This is how church leaders in the first century were commanded to view their relationship with the church. They're to be shepherds who love and serve and build up. Their titles aren't titles of glory or fame or special status. Their titles are of servanthood and responsibility. And this is how non-leaders in the church are to view themselves as well. I'm going to obey my spiritual leaders, but I'm going to live just like they are because I want to have the same type of faith. Not everyone is authorized to serve in certain positions, but all persons can still serve God by living the lifestyle expected of those in leadership positions. Excuse me while I get my pages in the correct order. And the point is this: just because you may not be a church leader doesn't mean that you're not a Christian leader. All Christians are to be leading lives that bring others to the cross. Leading lives that seeks to build up others, to strengthen them, to encourage them, to live righteous, self-controlled, humble lives. This is something that we're all called to do. You don't need a title to do the right thing. Titles don't change how valuable you are to God. And titles don't change how perfectly forgiven you are by God. And so, I said that was the last point, but apparently I was mistaken. Obey the law and seek the wisdom behind it. So this will be where we close. And this is what we were talking about in our adult Bible class today as we're reading through the book of Romans. On 3 different occasions throughout Numbers, we see that Israel has a question about a practice that wasn't covered in the law given by God. It's like, God, we're not looking for exceptions. We're just in this weird scenario that you didn't talk about. What do we do to celebrate the Passover? But it's like literally physically impossible for us to make it to the celebration because we're sick, because we're traveling. What do we do? Well, and the teaching that was given was you'll celebrate it 1 month later. And we see 2 other instances where that type of question arises. But the point that I want to get to here is this, that God did not codify for Israel every single aspect of their lives. There's a lot of laws given, but not enough to cover every single minute of their entire lives. And you know what? The New Testament today doesn't codify every single specific example and circumstance that we might find ourselves in. Just as one example, when we talked about in Romans this morning, or last week, we're talking about obeying authorities. All right, what do? We're supposed to obey our human authorities, but yet we see rebels are often lifted up. How do we reconcile this? God didn't tell me what to do in service to a president. The New Testament was written under a Caesar. Very different government structure. So what do we do with that? What do we do when God's law doesn't very specifically match the circumstance we find ourselves in? Well, we got to look for wisdom. We got to look for the wisdom behind the law. This is what Jesus is getting at when he says, you've heard don't murder, I say don't be angry. When you find yourselves in a circumstance that, hey, I can't find the exact book, chapter, verse that I was hoping to find, okay, look for the principle behind the teachings of God. Look for the principles behind the teachings. That's going to be how we can be right with God no matter where we are. So, Numbers. The book is the test of faith, where Israel faced many challenges, many opportunities to show their faith, but instead they chose otherwise. And that should really challenge us to ask the same question of ourselves. How will I live for God after witnessing his salvation? How will I let my faith rule in my life? Will I continue to live trusting in him, even times when I might not perfectly understand, or times when maybe my own desires are strong? Will I still serve him, or will I abandon the one true God for the gods of this world? Now that choice is ours, and it's a personal choice. God gives us that freedom that each individual can make that choice of their own, whether to remain faithful or not. The question is, will you be among the numbered when he returns, though? Will you be among those who are going to be raised up with Jesus into the heavens at the end of time? Have you made that choice yet? To put your sins behind you, to die with Christ in baptism for forgiveness, to live a life centered on the cross. If you're here this morning and you have any needs that we as a Christian family can help you with, we ask that you let us know before you leave. Don't miss the opportunity of this family here to help you through those. And maybe, if you're willing, that you'd even come forward as together we stand and sing.